Hey everyone, it's your girl, Sacrabolic, your envoy of hope, wondering why I don't have a standardized intro if what I say in the intro of these episodes of WIWR never changes. Boogiepop and Others is the latest of adaptation of the incredibly influential Boogiepop light novel series. It is about a person called Boogiepop, or I should say an alternate personality of a girl called Boogiepop, although Boogiepop's gender is actually ambiguous, that arrives to defeat threats to the entire world. And these threats could either be monsters that arise within the characters themselves due to some kind of special ability, or some kind of cloned alien, or some kind of artificially created person by a mysterious organization. But all in all, Boogiepop generally revolves around characters that are afflicted and affected by this supernatural occurrence that is a threat to the world, and it deals with how that threat arises, where it comes from, how it arises, what it does, and how it affects the people and, world around it, before Boogiepop usually arrives and ends up defeating the threat. Boogiepop is not the only person involved in trying to solve these problems, and sometimes the supernatural events end up conflicting with each other. But Boogiepop is usually the one that finishes the fight, I should say. It has it seems to adapt multiple light novels, I think like 4 or something, but I never read the Boogiepop series myself. It's pretty interesting, and I like how it dives into the characters' motivations, a little bit of their psychology. And it doesn't just focus on our main characters, it kind of expands to the world around it, and you get to see how people react and deal with the various situations they're put in. The biggest issue I have with it is that all of the characters look relatively similar, except for a few notable characters, like Boogiepop is fairly distinguishable, but a lot of them look very similar, and sometimes the timeline can actually jump around a little bit. And there's so many characters because it's an adaptation of several novels that it becomes kind of hard to keep track of all of the characters and everything that's happening. And I found myself having to refresh myself on who people were, because sometimes they'll just say a character's name and you're just expected to remember that fucking character. So I had to look up sometimes who the fuck they were referencing sometimes. But yeah, overall it was actually pretty interesting. It was really interesting to see the effect of the supernatural events on not just one person, but multiple people. And that's something you don't often see in these kind of supernatural shows where the problems arise from within yourself and shit. Choyoyu is about what can only be described as a group of Danganronpa characters getting isekai'd into a pretty generic fantasy world through a plane crash, which isn't really explained, but it's kind of hinted at that they're the chosen ones, I think the 7 chosen ones from some magical goddess or somehow or another. Anyway, the world itself is basically what you would expect from a generic fantasy world. There's an emperor, he's insane, the nobles are oppressing the populace, etc., etc., etc. So what these characters do is they end up using their ultimate talents to improve the life of the village, but this gets them in trouble with the nobility, and eventually they create the decision that they're just going to basically take over the world and bring democracy for all. Most of the show is pretty bog standard. I mean, it's enjoyable enough, but none of the characters are too standout. None of the events are out of the ordinary. It's kind of like a slightly better, less nationalistic version of Gate, except there's not a Gate, it's just a bunch of isekai protagonists. And each of the individual characters does kind of feel like they are, in a way, a protagonist, except for the magician, who's supposed to be an illusionist, but really just seems to be able to do whatever bullshit magic he wants. The characters are distinguishable enough, but there's nothing too great about any of it. Although I will say the first 3 episodes involve the economist getting into a sort of financial pissing match with a merchant who's trying to upsell him, And just watching those two have, like, economic barbs is by far the best part of the whole show. Honestly, if the entire thing was just the singular economist guy having, like, merchant wars, probably be a better show. But overall, decent, but definitely skippable. Circlet Princess is an anime based on a browser game where there's a new sport that uses VR to simulate, to enable single combat between two people. The sport seems to be primarily female-driven, and it is about a country bumpkin who, while exploring Tokyo, ends up getting accidentally drawn into an exhibition bout with the champion, and the fight between them ends up crashing the system, and it ends up being declared a tie. And then she has so much fun during this exhibition bout that she ends up working her butt off, and she ends up getting into a school that's supposed to have a program to enable this sport called Circlet Bout. But the school doesn't have a Circlet Bout team at the time, so she ends up, helping the club try and get started so that they can have their own Circlet Bout team and then participate in the Circlet Princess tournament, I think is what the tournament's called. So the story itself is pretty bog standard, and there's nothing special about the combat or the characters, either design-wise or story-wise. I think the most interesting thing that happens with the characters' stories overall is that the main character is, like, bizarrely good at this VR sport, and it turns out that, I'm saying VR, it's more of a hologram, and it turns out that the reason that she's so good is because she's moving so fast that the system can't keep up, and it just doesn't properly render her attacks for her opponents, so she's basically attacking invisibly and lag stabbing them, which I think is actually a hilarious reason, although it doesn't explain why at any point she is able to move so fast, but it is known that the champion also moves that fast. And so that's why she was able to tie the champion. The reason that the system crashed was because they both lagged the system at the same time, and it just couldn't keep up with them, and it just broke, which I think is funny that the main character isn't actually good. She's just exploiting this broken system in this new sport. What I find most interesting and most flawed about the show, though, is the sport itself, and I wonder if this is caused by the browser game not making any goddamn sense, or if this is caused by the anime just adapting it shittily. But Circlet Bout is a one-on-one exhibition fight between two people. However, it's considered a team sport because you have to have a minimum of 5 people in your Circlet Bout team. So it's one team against the other team in one-on-one fights. However, the winner of the battles is determined out of best 2 out of 3. So, what? Why do you need 5 people if you're going to determine your match out of 2 out of 3? Why wouldn't it be 3 out of 5? Then there's a chance that everyone on the team could fight. That doesn't make any sense. More than that, combat sports are usually just solo sports and not team sports. Why is Circlet Bout a team sport in the first place? I do not understand the rules to this fucking fight. Furthermore, it seems like most enemies in a Circlet Bout go down in one attack. However, there are rare instances of characters being hit several times in a fight and then not losing. So I don't understand how you win. The main character's weapon breaks several times, and other characters' weapons break several times, and the second their weapon breaks, they're considered to have lost the match. However, at one point, the main character's weapon breaks, and she just keeps fighting, and it's like, well, I guess that's fine. But then, when the champion's weapon breaks at the end, her weapon breaks, and she's considered to have lost the round, even though she wasn't hit and she was still able to fight. I literally don't understand the rules of this sport, and I don't understand why the rules are what they are. And at one point, one of the enemies was able to use their uniform colors and decide the color of the arena, and they were able to camouflage their attacks inside of the arena. How that is allowed by any sport, I have no fucking clue, and it baffles me. And there's certain numbers of resources that certain characters are allowed to have allocated to them. And this seems to be based on actual money, but it also seems to have a functional, effect on the in the game of in the actual sport for some fucking reason. Like, there are instances of people from outside the game giving the resources required to form their weapons to the actual participants in the bouts, but then there's limits to, I think, the amount of resources you can use in a bout in the first place, because this came up in one of the earlier fights where the main character's team was only allowed to shoot 2 bullets in one fight because of the amount of resources. And it was revealed that they have a handicap against them because they're a newer team. So not only is there a limit to the amount of money you're allowed to spend in this, and the money seems to come from arbitrary places, but newer teams are handicapped against them. Like, usually, if you have a handicap, it's like the newer team handicapping the more experienced team. But no, the newer teams are the ones that receive the handicap. I don't understand this sport. Dororo and Hyakkimaru, also known as Dororo, is a black and white anime from 1969, and I think it is officially the oldest anime series I've watched. It is about a young man named Hyakkimaru, whose dad, in order to acquire political power, sold his body parts to 48 demon statues carved by, I think, some crazy monk man for some reason. He meets a young thief named Dororo, who spends most of the series, 25 episodes, pretending to be a boy, and then in the final episode, you find out that Dororo is a girl. The series itself is kind of named after Dororo, which is fitting because most of the episodes actually focus on her. But it has a basic formula of Dororo gets separated from Hyakkimaru, a demon shows up, she gets in trouble, Hyakkimaru kills the demon, and then Dororo gets one of his body parts back every time he kills one of the demons. Some of these body parts make total sense. Like, he gets his teeth back, his eyes, his ears, his arms and legs, you know. Those are the normal ones. But then there are some that are just so fucking ridiculous, I could not believe them. At one point, he gets his skin back. At one point, he gets his voice back, and it's like, how the fuck were you talking the entire time? What? And he gets his backbone back at one point, and I'm like, wait a minute, how the fuck was he standing? How do you work, Hyakkimaru? How does your body physically function? And the explanation given is that his body is like Frankenstein from a bunch of prosthetics by a crazy doctor man who like adopted him as a child when he was some sort of horrible caterpillar. But the more we learn about the body parts that Hyakkimaru gets back, the more you can't help but picture this like limbless, legless, eyeless, skinless, teethless, voiceless horror caterpillar that this crazy doctor man just grabs and is like, well, I'm just gonna fucking shove a bunch of prosthesis on it and make a fucking person. Like, the fact that he found this horrible caterpillar in a fucking river in his first idea, and I'm not creating the word caterpillar, they describe him as a caterpillar. He find this fucking horrible skinless caterpillar, and his first thought was, I'm gonna shove so many prosthesis on it that I make a person, and then he does? It's fucking insane. It's ludicrous. The plot of this is fucking ridiculous. Most of the enemies they encounter with the demons seem to be based on classic Japanese yokai, and it's kind of interesting the little takes they take with it, but none of them are really standout, except for one guy who's like this priest that was hoarding food, and he encounters this like gluttony yokai that I don't actually recognize the original on, but I'm sure it's probably just something I'm forgetting about. But he ends up, every time he rings the bell, he force feeds the priest. And at one point, he like rubs the priest's belly and he's like, ah, yes, this will make a fine home indeed. Open up your belly button. And I'm like, that is the most intimidating fucking thing I have ever heard. Are you kidding me? Anyway, most of the episodes are pretty bland, and the whole thing moves at an absolutely glacial speed. And what's worse is that at the end, we're only like 28, 30 demons in, and then Dororo and Hyakkimaru get separated, and Hyakkimaru just goes and like finishes up all of the others up until like number 47 off screen, when he ends up having to kill his dad at number 48. I mean, it's an interesting anime as far as like a historical perspective, but it's not great. Then I watched Date A Live Season 3. Now, it had been about 3 years, I think, since I watched season 2, and I'm gonna be honest, I did forget parts of what had happened in the series previously. Luckily, this was a pretty good watch. The opening episodes introduce a new spirit, Natsumi, who, and I think this is a great plot line, she said she disguised herself as one of the girls by replacing the girl, and then challenges the main character to figure out who was replaced. And whenever he fails to guess who was replaced, she abducts more people and they slowly vanish. And I think that is a fucking great plot, especially because of how good Natsumi is at duplicating people. And then the next plot was a little dumb. It involved like time travel and going back into the past, and then you find out one character actually killed their parents in the past. It's not bad. It was entertaining. It was just, it kind of dragged a little bit, and although there were some good twists and turns, I don't think anything was too stand out about it. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was good. I just don't think it was anything particularly noteworthy or anything I feel like I actually have to get in depth with. But the final episode does a complete, reverse on the formula of Date A Live, where the main character is on a timer where he could die if he doesn't get his powers sealed, which is usually the opposite of what happens, and he decides to be difficult about it in the greatest way possible. And so he challenges the girls to have to woo him by the end of the day. And it's a complete reversal on the formula, and the whole episode is just a treat. Overall, it is a pretty good season, but I don't think it's as good as some of the seasons in the past. Dororo 2019 managed to be surprising to me in that it is worse than the 1969 version of the same anime in almost every single way. And they've had 50 years to fix all of the problems with the original. And yet they somehow looked at the original story, and maybe this has to do with the manga, but I don't think so. Because from what I understand, the 2019 version is actually less faithful to the manga, but they managed to look at the manga and somehow see everything it did wrong and was like, let's do it all but worse. First and foremost is that in the original, Dororo was revealed to be a girl in the final episode. This reveal comes way earlier in this version of the show. There's nothing too wrong with that, except for as a character that is supposed to be passing as male, they have made the bizarre decision to make Dororo the most feminine character in the entire show. The basic outline of the 2019 version follows it has a lot of the same beats as the original, like they encounter the same monsters and they do the same plot lines. There's a few added in there. I think most notably was they do a sort of twist on the couple yokai, where there's this man-eater and then there's this good-natured man that comes along, and then they have a little romance. And I think that was actually good. I would actually dare to say that was probably the best, if not the only really genuinely good part about this show, was the cute little romance between the couple. But one of the bigger issues that this show has, I feel like, is that if you completely ignore the original and you just take it for what it is, the show doesn't really establish its characters very well, and there's not much in the way of arcs for most of the characters to begin with. So the characters end up coming off incredibly flat. Another thing this show does is it genuinely goes harder on the gore and the violence and the misery, dipping so far as to being misery porn at times. And it seems like this version of the show seems more interested in displaying how miserable and bad off its characters are than it is making us care about these characters that are miserable. So when you see like a character get like impaled into a fucking cross, crucified. It's like, yeah, that's the thing I'm seeing. Like, you don't care because you don't have any emotional connection, and the show rarely tries to put in any time or effort. I feel like the main focus of this is probably more Hyakkimaru than Dororo, which is okay, because I think the original may have focused a little too much on Dororo. But the issue is that they have also made the baffling decision to take away Hyakkimaru's ability to speak. And so Dororo is forced to kind of bounce off of other characters while Hyakkimaru kind of functions like a robot. And maybe they were trying to go with a sort of learning emotions plot line, but it ended up coming off pretty flat because for the most part, Hyakkimaru just functions like a robot. They kind of delve into this Hyakkimaru is becoming a demon kind of subplot, but it falls really flat because they're like, oh, Hyakkimaru has killed people, but yeah, like so has 90% of the rest of the cast, and they've killed more people, and most of the people that Hyakkimaru kills are either related to or helping the demons, and he mostly just kills demons. And sure, I mean, like, there could be an argument for like a one-sided ambition being why he's seen as demonic, but that's not the argument the show makes. It's because he kills people, but they're not willing to like dive into what makes Hyakkimaru demonic as opposed to what makes the other characters. It's something they put in there as a source of tension to kind of give you this like dualistic human versus demon path, but it ends up falling completely flat because it's just simply not willing to engage with its own premise and explore how Hyakkimaru perhaps contrasts against other characters that might be in similar positions. It just puts it out there for you and is like, check this fucking thing out. What I will say is that they ended up, instead of killing off the brother early, they ended up making him his own character. And I wouldn't say he's my favorite character in the show, but I would say he's probably the best in that he does have a starting point where he's sort of naive, and then he ends up getting a more grim like outlook on the world, and he becomes determined to kill Hyakkimaru before softening up and becoming a better person at the end. Like, he's the only character I can say that has an actual genuine arc with what feels like earned story beats. I mean, he's not interesting, but he's at least well written, and I can appreciate that. Although, speaking of him, this does remind me that at the end of the show, Hyakkimaru's mom and the guy that gave him his prosthetics and the brother, even though there's enough time to pull them out of the burning building, they just like shove him through a door, and then they just all universally are like, I guess we're gonna die for no reason. Oh my fucking god. Yeah, they just fucking burn to death. They don't even try to get out. They don't even try to. It would be so easy to get out. I don't understand why they all universally decided to just burn to death. The final battle was anticlimactic. He just, like, the ground opens up and he just stabs a crystal. I don't understand. Oh, they did do something cool with the horse yokai, though, where Hyakkimaru goes fucking bug nuts and he rides it into battle. And I actually think that was a lot more interesting than when they tried to make you feel bad for him killing the horse yokai. He was going to have to kill no matter what anyway. But I think the biggest question I have is why they would have possibly decided to not give him the ability to speak. I know it was really stupid in the original that he couldn't speak, so he used like telepathy or some shit. But if they were already gonna like reduce the number of demons from 48 to 12, which was fucking the correct thing to do, if they were already gonna play around with that, it would have made more sense to just give him the ability to speak earlier so he could bounce off of people and, be a fucking character. I don't understand the thought process behind that. I think they were trying to make him more compelling as he became more human, but really it just ended up fucking making the show more boring. And then at the end, because I'm just gonna spoil this fucker at this point, who cares? I don't fucking care, this is fucking garbage. At the end, in the original, Hyakkimaru ends up leaving Dororo because he has to get, like, the remainder of his, like, 18 body parts or something. But in this, he just leaves because I don't know why. Like, he's supposed to go on a personal journey to find his humanity because he just started living or whatever. And it's like, what the fuck does that mean? If he's going on his personal journey to find his humanity now, then what the fuck was the point of the rest of the show? Like, are you telling me that are you telling me Hyakkimaru wasn't finding his humanity throughout the course of this show? Why did I fucking watch this then? Because fucking Dororo doesn't end up anywhere. Dororo at the end of this uses the fucking bandit money to try and create a country without samurai, which makes no fucking sense. Because sure, samurai are causing the problems in the war, but like your solution to not having samurai is having a bunch of fucking money. But like, the money you have came from your parents' banditry anyway. So it's like, if you don't have any samurai to defend your country, which is kind of the purpose of a fucking samurai, what's to stop a bunch of enemy samurai from another country coming in and stealing your fucking money in the first place? I don't know. This is not a smart show. Dr. Stone is a series where all of humanity is petrified, and then like 3,700 years later, a high school scientist with improbable scientific knowledge ends up getting freed, and he begins to try and free people from their petrification, but he mostly just ends up trying to like advance society through scientific endeavors by recreating technology that had previously existed using his improbable scientific knowledge. The series' science itself can be pretty dubious at times, but I think the main reason I'm not upset about it like I would be with something like Clockwork Planet is I don't feel like Dr. Stone is a series where the scientific knowledge, the scientific terms being put out there are there to make the series seem smarter. I feel like the science is being put in there because it seems like the creator genuinely loves and appreciates science. And I think that's the key difference between something that just throws out science to seem smart, like Fire Force or something, rather than something that's just having fun with it. And I can appreciate how it does that. None of the characters are particularly great. Think most of them are pretty one note, pretty flat. I like Gen, and I really appreciate the character of Gen because he's a sort of low-key trickster-esque character, and it's so easy to make them the bad guys. And at first he kind of was the bad guy, but they flip him. He does like a face turn, and it seems like he's pretty well established as a babyface at this point. And I really appreciate like the trickster on their side, because that's you rarely see that. On the other hand, the similar situation comes up with a character called Tsukasa, who's like the main villain, and I have to say that pretty much every problem with the show is related to this character, because Tsukasa is originally introduced because the main character and his best friend are being chased by a group of lions, which I'm pretty sure they're all male lions, which makes no fucking sense anyway. So check another mark against Tsukasa there. And so they wake him up, and this dude just like one-shots the lions. And at first it seems like he's like sympathetic to the lions and, you know, like a good dude. And I kind of had some hope that instead of just being like a blatantly evil character or like a villain or whatever, he'd be more like a Sakura from Danganronpa, like a sort of gentle giant that's there just to kind of like keep shit in check. But they almost immediately go the other way, and he like kills some old dude's statue. And you find out that Tsukasa basically wants to kill all of the adults and only resurrect the children and teenagers because he thinks that adults are evil. And the only words I have to describe Tsukasa's goals are completely fucking asinine. It's asinine is the word that keeps coming up when I think of fucking Tsukasa, because his idea is that like if they revive all of the adults, they're going to use their weapons and they're going to use science to try and reestablish their properties. and hold other people down. And that makes zero fucking sense, because if they have to reestablish society, most people aren't going to know where their old property is in the first place. And just because Senku, the main character, makes a fucking gun doesn't mean he's going to give guns to literally everyone. I mean, keep in mind, this takes place in Japan, where most people don't have guns anyway. The only reason that you can hold on to property is because there's a structure there designed to limit who has the power of defending their property. But if this is like a whole new world, you can't fucking defend your property. I mean, you don't even have to worry about that bullshit. But it's also ignoring the fact that he thinks that like adults are cruel and evil because some old man yelled at him for fucking taking seashells off a beach at one point. It's implied there's more to it than that, but that's all the show showed, was that. Which is fucking hilarious to me, because within, I think it was like a week or two of being released, Tsukasa immediately goes on a fucking murder rampage, which his implication of like children and teenagers are all innocent and it's the adults that are all evil is completely undermined by his own actions, where he immediately goes on a murder rampage, starts forming an army of people under him where he's the king, and then when Senku tries to go against his ideals, he tries to kill Senku. And then when Senku takes refuge with the only other village of humans not under Tsukasa's control, Tsukasa immediately declares war on them and then burns their houses down. So his very actions are so hypocritical that they undermine his actual objectives immediately. He is by far the worst character. And it, like, more than that, and I'm not just like upset about like how it's fucking horrible this character is. I mean, I understand that he's like a representation of brain versus brawn, but I don't think that he's a necessary character to begin with. I think Dr. Stone has a premise of trying to revive civilization after it's been petrified and been overtaken by nature. And if we were trying to do a brain versus brawn sort of scenario like Tsukasa seems to represent, that would be made completely unnecessary by the introduction of the dangerous wildlife that would just be naturally occurring in the environment. However, even though Tsukasa was originally revived to combat the environment, after the main character gets separated from him and loses that protection, the main character then proceeds to live in the wilderness by himself for about a fucking year by himself and never encounters another group of male lions to try and fucking eat him. So he's introduced with this like completely contrived introduction, and he's just there to create an artificial conflict. And I think that even without him, using nature as a sort of representation of brawn and using that as a sort of antagonistic force, as we get to see Senku more even-handedly recreate civilization rather than just make random scientific leaps in strange directions that aren't useful to anything. Like most of the scientific creations that Senku makes are designed to combat Tsukasa. But this is unfortunate because it means that he just makes some crazy bullshit that no one's going to ever use. He's basically not building civilization because Tsukasa is slowing him down. But in a way, this also slows down the premise that Dr. Stone had in the first place, which is the rebuilding of civilization. So I don't think Tsukasa, even with what he represents, is a necessary part of the narrative to begin with. I think he ultimately just slows the show down, even though it's supposed to seem exciting because they keep adding in the tension and the stakes. There's enough hardship with living in a wilderness environment where you have to rebuild from the Stone Age that you wouldn't require this antagonistic force in the first place. And I will say, though, something I did forget about is we do see a bit of how the village arrived, and it was related to like astronauts who came down to the planet. And I'm not going to get too much into this, and I'm not going to get into the spoilers of that. But what I do appreciate about that is that the astronaut group is actually interesting enough that I would be interested in seeing a sort of like prequel about them. Not necessarily, I'm not going to say that they're more interesting than the events of the show itself. The show itself is pretty decent. But I would be interested to see what also happened with them and, you know, what adventures they had as well. I do hear, back to Tsukasa, though, that he's not really the villain, which, I mean, at the very least in season 1, he is for sure a textbook definition of villain. I mean, he's a fucking insane autocrat that is attempting to murder people for his own goals. That's as villainous as you can get. So even if he's not like the main villain or the main antagonist of the series, I hear the manga, he does get better as time goes on. But with what I have with Dr. Stone season 1, almost the entirety of the problems with this show are related to that character. The Price of Smiles is an anime that takes place in the far future in a different world where humanity has apparently moved to other planets, but it takes place on one specific planet, which's name I don't fucking remember. And it is set on a world where almost all of the prevalent military technology is based around mechs that are powered by some random mineral that they discovered on the planet that we later find out more is causing the destruction of the world or some blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter. Anyway, the planet is split in half by two countries, one of which is an empire centered around the military, and the other one is a monarchy that we don't know too much about, but the monarchist side has significantly more advanced technology and the people are generally have a higher quality of life as opposed to the militaristic empire where the quality of life is significantly lower, there's less resources, and everything is just generally shittier and they have worse technology. And it opens up with the main character who is named Princess Yuki, who is just turned 12 and is ready to start taking over the duties of her kingdom. But what she doesn't know is that they are actually already at war with the military empire. And her advisors try and keep this from her, but she ends up finding out later that they are already at war with the military empire who is invading them for their technology and their resources. And so what the show, and the show also has a secondary main character who is one of the soldiers of the Empire named Stella, but she has very minimal impact on the plot and almost doesn't matter at all. She's just a grunt soldier. She makes a few decisions towards the end, but most of it's just nothing. And Yuki's basically the main character, and she kind of goes into this like naive sort of like headspace where she's trying to make it so everyone survives, including the enemies, and she wants to make everyone happy and smile at the end. And her actions throughout the show generally get people killed more often than not. Like, she definitely makes the situation worse with almost her every decision. And what's interesting is that at the beginning, they kind of show that she has like a good mind for battle tactics, but because of her actual like mind space about how she doesn't want anyone to get hurt, she never really uses them except for in like 2 instances to retreat from battles. And it ends up getting people in more and more more and more problems. And like when she starts taking over military and making military decisions, more people start dying to the Empire. So she's actually a terrible leader is what I'm saying. But again, she's 12. And honestly, I think 12 is too young to be sitting on that fucking throne. She should definitely be under the command of a regent until she is, like, actually psychologically mature enough to understand the situation. I will say that the show is actually pretty good. It manages to create several moments of genuine dramatic tension. It actually kept me guessing. It kept me wanting to watch. Multiple times I was like, all right, this is the last episode, and then the end of the episode stinger gets out, and I'm like, well, okay, fine, one more episode. It does make an interesting decision, though, which is that the monarchist side, I genuinely do not remember what Yuki's fucking group is called. The Kingdom, I think. I think one side's the Empire and one side's the Kingdom. We're going to call them Yuki's group. Yuki's group is obviously, you know, they're the defenders, they're being attacked, they're the ones being ruled by a child and everyone's dying and it's all terrible. But we don't spend as much time with their groups outside of military endeavors and like seeing like the tragic losses and Yuki making a bunch of dumb fucking decisions as we do with Stella's group in the Empire, who Stella's group is really more humanized. And I think the decision to humanize the aggressors is an interesting one and an important one, because it shows that the Empire isn't completely evil and that they do have reasons and motivations for what they're doing. But the amount of humanization that the Empire cast receives in comparison to Yuki's group is like so much more And it kind of undermines your appreciation for the Empire's group, in that you know that they're the aggressors, and multiple scenes, multiple episodes even, are dedicated to how their attack on Yuki's kingdom is actively making everyone's lives worse and how they feel bad about it. So the decision to almost exclusively humanize that side and kind of just leave Yuki and her crew to just deal with the military implications of the war is kind of not a great one. And I feel like they're just banking on the knowledge that Yuki's group is not the aggressors so that you automatically feel for them, but it ends up creating that side of the field to be a little flat. Overall, it was a pretty good show. The ending was bullshit, but I definitely enjoyed the ride. It was good, not great. Fairy Gone, the anime I almost forgot I watched until I started watching the second part of it. Fairy Gone is a series that takes place in a world where two countries have just mostly recently, within like the past decade, just finished a war, and we're coming to a sort of gritted teeth, peace. During the war, fairies, which are just, they're less fanciful than like traditional fairies, but they're basically fairies. They're called fairies. Were used, and part of their body organs were implanted into soldiers called fairy soldiers as part of the war. In peacetime, collecting fairies and having fairy organs in your body and all of that is generally considered illegal. And in at least the country that the story takes place in, there is an organization called Dorothea, which uses fairy soldiers and invites other fairy soldiers into their ranks in order to sort of police unregulated fairy usage. The overall plot of the actual series is about a specific book called the Fairy Tome, and specifically a part of the Fairy Tome that was lost called the Black Fairy Tome, and the organization is trying to get a hold of the pieces of the Black Fairy Tome that has been since lost. The main character ends up joining the organization Dorothea because her childhood friend, who she hasn't seen in some time, I think 9 years, has been going after pieces of the Black Fairy Tome for a reason I'm not sure we know yet. We just know she's going after it. While the story is all about acquiring the pieces of the Black Fairy Tome, they get into trouble with multiple crime groups. The story itself has a lot of characters and a lot of enemy organizations, and it can honestly be kind of hard to keep track and keep everything straight of what's going on. It's just constantly throwing terms at you. Plot itself can be a little slow moving, so it can be kind of hard to get into the overall story of it. Soundtrack's pretty okay, and the core cast is identifiable enough that you never really lose track of them. But I feel except for the main two characters, we don't really know anything about the core cast either. We have a general idea of their personalities, but we don't know what their deal is. And the fight scenes can actually be pretty exciting. Fairy Gone is a sort of middle of the row series. I would say there's probably more good than bad, but it's definitely not something I feel strongly about. Fairy Gone Season 1, Part 2 starts off with the reveal of a secret cult that is manipulating the events of the kingdom, and they find the Black Fairy Tome that they were looking for in Part 1. And it reveals that in order to release the first fairy from its slumber, so that it can go on a murderous rampage and kill everyone, they need, the heart of someone who is fairy possessed, like the main character is. There's a whole bunch to it. They reveal an evil government conspiracy / cult. They have a goal to unleash a horrible monster. They find the Black Fairy Tome, so the MacGuffin's just gone. It just gets it disappears. None of it mattered. I can't help but feel like there was setups that never paid off. I don't think we ever figured out what Bittersweet's deal was. Anyway, doesn't really matter. The first part of the season is actually pretty slow moving and not terribly interesting, but like the last 3 or 4 episodes are actually pretty exciting, pretty solid all the way through. The ending actually genuinely surprised me. Not completely, obviously, but there were definitely like one key part of it that I was like, wow, I didn't see that coming. Overall, it was decent, but it wasn't anything special. I can see why it's not a particularly popular show. Finally, Kemono Michi Rise Up. Kemono Michi is about a professional wrestler named Genzo, who, I say professional wrestler, but he's not like a scripted professional wrestler. He's kind of part of that like fictional professional wrestling where professional wrestling is real and people would die all the time if it was actually real. Gets summoned, he gets isekai'd to another world and he's asked to defeat the Demon King by the princess, but he loves animals so much that he refuses to fight monsters, and when she mentions that he has to fight monsters, he just fucking suplexes her and then, like, breaks out of the castle and escapes from all of the guards. So he ends up, like, meeting I think she's like a cat or something girl that I don't know what animal she's supposed to be, that's about to be sold into slavery, and he ends up saving her, but this one's a little different because she's actually selling herself into slavery because she ran up a huge debt on a failed business venture. And she has a sort of like money grubbing like personality, but not to like a ludicrous or unreasonable degree. And she's common joke throughout the series is that they keep going bankrupt in their attempts for the main character to achieve his dream of opening up a monster pet shop. And as the series goes on, they encounter other quirky characters, including one of the daughters of one of like the 4 like Devil King generals or dukes. I forget the exact, I think they use the term duke, but it's the same plot you've always seen. And her lesser vampire servant. And then eventually the main character's old rival from his world ends up getting summoned to aid in the Demon King. And one thing I'll say about this is that it kind of overuses the same gags over and over again, like how they keep going into debt and, you know, they keep ending up like bankrupt, and how the dragon girl keeps like eating them out of house and home, and like they keep like suplexing the princess and everyone starts laughing at her butt. What I will say is that towards the end of it, it almost seemed like the constant like butt exposure jokes was starting to lead into the princess becoming an exhibitionist, and despite the constant jokes about the lesser vampires like drinking, it almost seemed like it was beginning to evolve into more of a character flaw. So it seemed like Kemono Michi was developing its constant overused gags, and boy does it overuse them, into sort of actual like ongoing character traits. But I can't judge what I think might happen in the future. I have to go what happens in this. And they didn't start to develop those gags quite to where it would have needed to actually be worthwhile. So it just seems really repetitive right now. I also didn't expect, despite the main character being a professional wrestler, to it sort of morph into being from about a character fighting animals and trying to open up a pet shop. This has nothing to do with a pet shop, weirdly enough, or magical animals. It almost exclusively becomes about professional wrestling as it goes on, and I didn't they have multiple like wrestling matches that are funded by the bank. I really didn't see the direction this was going. I have to say, I find the main character completely insufferable. He is like a complete asshole to anyone who is not like a beast man or an animal or a monster. And he is like obnoxiously obsessed with them. I get that it's his character trait, but he comes off as a real dick. Yeah, it's a real mixed bag. There's definitely some good things about it, but overall, it's a middle of the row show. So there you have it. Kemono Michi is actually a pretty substantial series for me because it marks the 750th anime I have completed. And my desire to wait for big old number 750 was actually what caused this video to come out for so long, and why there's like 11 anime as part of this episode of WIWR when I've been trying to keep it to like 5 or 6 or something. But I just really wanted to hit that benchmark. And now that we've hit the 200 romance and the 750 completed, I honestly probably am very far off from another benchmark. So hopefully I can start out putting these episodes of WIWR more consistently. Who knows? Who knows? The new editing style is definitely working for me. But yeah, if you want to know what I'm up to when I'm not watching anime and making videos on watching anime, which is 99.9% of the time, I also have a Twitch channel. We started knocking out games pretty quickly at this point, and for like the past 3 or 4 weeks, I've been doing like a 12-hour stream every week. So we've been getting really heavy into it, and we've been knocking out games quickly. So we have coming up Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots, Drakengard 3, and Echo Knights. I don't think in that order. I think Echo Knights comes before Drakengard 3. But yeah, we're going through games so fast, it's just easier to say the next 3 games than the next game. But anyway, yeah, hope you had fun with it. I've been Sacrobolic, your Envoy of Hope, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.